Okay, welcome everybody to Taking the Power Back. This is hosted by our group from the GC2Y class called Sex and Resistance in collaboration with the Women's Center, LGBTQ Programs, and also Project BRAVE. Today we will be hearing from a panel speaking on the topic of power-based interpersonal violence in conjunction with October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We have 3 different speakers and then a question and answer at the end. So our speakers consist of Christy Showalter, who is the Associate Director of Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And then we have Langston Walker, who is a contractor/trainer for a few different agencies. And then one of Georgia College's very own, Khyla Guishard, who works with Project BRAVE and is also a peer facilitator. So we're going to go ahead and begin with Showalter starting us off, Christy Showalter. And she's going to talk a little bit about why domestic violence happens. So take it away.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you for having me as part of this discussion today. I'm happy to be with all of you. I just wanted to briefly, before we jumped into some of these questions, just kind of say that I know I will perhaps be switching back and forth between different terminology of sometimes saying domestic violence, sometimes saying intimate partner violence, sometimes abuse. Really, all 3 of those terms are very similar in their meaning and in their definition, especially in like a social context. They each kind of have sometimes a different connotation to them, though. Intimate partner violence is somewhat of the term that is being more commonly used in today's kind of world, because it doesn't have that connotation of people having to be married or living together. So it tends to more inclusive of a variety of different types of intimate relationships. And when we're talking about these terms, essentially what we mean is a pattern of behaviors that someone is using in order to get or maintain power and control over an intimate partner that they are either currently in a relationship with or formerly were in a relationship with. And the key parts of that is that it is a pattern of behaviors. It's not an isolated incidence of violence, and that it can take on many different forms. It can be emotional, mental, verbal, can be physical, it can be economic abuse, can be sexual violence and sexual abuse. So it can look like a variety of different tactics that are happening. And when we think about what causes intimate partner violence or why it's happening, there are lots of different ways and different angles that we can look at that. So it's somewhat difficult to kind of sum that up for you really quickly, but I wanted to kind of first talk about it from an individual level, because that's oftentimes where we start and where we most commonly think of it. So within an individual relationship, intimate partner violence is really a learned behavior of using violence in order to get and maintain that control over another partner. It's learned by seeing other people within our world, whether it's within our family unit or within the community around us. It's seeing those behaviors and tactics being used in relationships, and then just absorbing that and essentially being conditioned to believe that that kind of behavior is acceptable. Or even if it's not exactly considered 100% acceptable, it's really when we look deep down into it, it's tolerable. It's considered allowable. It's something that our society has not really taken the right approach or a strong approach in ending it. And much of the interventions and solutions and approaches that we have taken over the last 40 years or more to stop this kind of violence have not been successful largely. And in fact, many of the things that we have chosen, like the criminal justice response, have actually caused harm to a lot of survivors and the people that they're in a relationship with, especially within communities of color. And so that pattern of learning it and seeing it in the world around us, and learning and seeing that there really isn't a serious consequence for most people, or at least there's not an effective intervention for it, is what allows that pattern to continue, both within that relationship that the cycle continues, within the family unit, and then really within, intergenerational, just continues on into the future. Some of the other things that can exacerbate that violence within that relationship are things like drug and alcohol use, mental illness, things within the life of that person who is causing harm, anything within their life where they feel out of control. Could be job loss or financial instability, lack of housing, a sudden serious health diagnosis, anything that's going to make them feel like they are out of control, especially which many of us can maybe identify with that right now during this pandemic, that there is so much of that is out of our control. That heightens the tendency of this person to then want to get control of their partner. And so any of those factors can exacerbate that underlying tendency of them to use these kind of tactics and this violence in their relationship. It's important to understand that they are not causing the violence, that they individually are not what is triggering it to happen or causing it to happen. I'm sure we all know people who struggle with substance abuse, people who may be living in poverty, people who have mental illness, and they do not use violence in their relationship. So the two things are not, there's not that exact causation type of relationship, but they are interrelated. So looking at it from that individual level, that's the basics of it. But I believe firmly, and I'm sure that Khyla and Langston also may speak to this, that it's also important for us to take a macro look, a step back at what is causing this to happen. And so if we look at what is it at a society level that is causing this to happen, we have to see intimate partner violence as being part of a larger system of oppression that is holding power over and harming different groups of people based on their race, their ethnicity, their sexuality or their gender identity, their disability, age, any of those kinds of identities or experiences that may cause individuals to be marginalized and oppressed. Intimate partner violence is related and interconnected with those things. And at the root level, it shares many of the same kind of causes with those things. And so we cannot just look at them in this siloed approach one by one. They are all linked together. And we can't really talk about or think about ever ending intimate partner violence or gender-based violence until we also end those other forms of oppression, because they're linked together. And I could talk more about then what are some of those root causes, but I'm guessing that we may get into that and into some of our other discussion. So I'm not sure if there's anything else about that specific question of why domestic violence happens, or what causes it, that our other two speakers may want to chime in
on. Christy, how do you think traditional ideas about like gender roles contribute to domestic violence?
They are definitely a part of it. And to me, that's linked back to the system of oppression, that gender roles come from this structure of patriarchy and misogyny. Um, so they are part of what's happening, that within um, these relationships where violence is occurring, oftentimes the abusive partner, or the person that's using violence, is usually the male partner. And so they're using that male privilege either in a very overt way to say, like, I am the head of this household and therefore you will do what I say, or even in instances where it might have the appearances of being a more equal relationship and the person doesn't throw their weight around in that way. They're using their male privilege in a way that allows them to get away with committing this type of harm, and no one is really doing much to stop it.
Thank you. That would definitely answer that question for sure. If Langston, you want to talk a little bit more like why it happens and or how to prevent it?
Of course. And thank you so much for having me. It's happy Saturday. It's good to be here, really enjoying it, and just kind of enjoying the conversation so far. I love a lot of what Christy said, because I think, like, she's spot on in terms of talking about social norms and just like kind of like thinking about this in real ways. It's funny. I'm not used to doing Zoom things and I talk with my hands a lot. So sorry as I wave and do all of this, but what comes up for me more than anything when I think of preventing domestic violence or even intimate partner violence, or however you want to define it, is I think we have to look at the people who are actually committing the violence, right? And what stats show is that overwhelmingly you see that men are the ones who are actually committing the violence in these relationships, right? And it's my belief, right, just based on the work that I've done, most importantly at Men Stopping Violence, where I've worked with men who've used abusive and controlling behaviors in relationships, that we'll see a stop or an end to intimate partner violence when men stand up, say that we're going to stop it, and we say that it's not okay. The reality is that I think, a lot of these behaviors, we can talk about like societal factors and economics and all of this, but at the end of the day, these behaviors are choices. And I think by like really being intentional about that and really, really thinking about that, we can kind of like start to say, how do we address these choices and deal with them in a real way that's effective? I think social norms are incredibly important. Like, Christy brought it up, but like the idea that we say, I could just throw out like a phrase like a man's home is his, right, castle, right? And we all know that, we all nod, and we've all heard that before. And when I think of a castle, traditionally, if that male figure in the castle is the king, and then everyone else that lives in the castle is servants. And what we see, or the queen for that matter, but what we see is this kind of like hierarchical relationship. And unfortunately, that plays its way out in relationships, right? Like it determines, who has the say in terms of how decisions are made in the household. It plays its way out in things like second shifting, where you'll see a woman who does work outside of the home and she comes back after her long day of work and kind of has to do that second shift of work when she gets home, like to take care of children, to take care of family, to take care, in some cases, of that man who is unwilling or chooses not to pick up his clothes from the floor. So there's so many ways that like you see this like play out. It's always something to think about. But I think that if we want to talk about preventing this, right, we have to really talk about what does it mean to kind of like talk to men and speak to men and be very, very clear and say that this is not okay. And more than that, also be really intentional about intervening with men in communities, and think about it in a different way. And just the last piece that comes up for me is I think about the criminal legal system. I'm being very intentional in using that language of saying criminal legal system and as opposed to criminal justice system, because I think what happens is that, and Christy started to speak to this, but I think when we think of things in terms of a criminal legal response, when does the criminal legal system intervene? It intervenes when people start hitting each other, right? And if you look at abusive behavior in relationships or power and control in relationships, there are so many things that take place that cause harm that happen before someone starts hitting someone, right? You know, like no one's going to jail for interrupting, no one's going to jail for controlling money, no one's going to jail for using passive aggressive behavior or being sarcastic, no one's going to jail around coercion around sexuality for the most part. Like these things are just kind of seen as normal, and part of what it means to live. Like the Aziz Ansari thing that came out a couple of years ago in the article from Babe makes me think, and even just not even that, but the response to that, and how a lot of people in society were like, it's just a bad date and this is just what happens, and not kind of seeing the whole overarching like just stuff that we all have responsibility and we all have culpability in, and we can all call out, is part of kind of like, how do we address this? How do we prevent it? How do we say, you know what, that's kind of messed up, that's really like stinking thinking, and how do we shift it and move in a different way and say that this isn't healthy or moving towards a healthier norm in terms of relationships? So.
Thank you, Langston. And I really think that is definitely applicable on college campuses and the relationships, and as we're learning in this pivotal, important time in our lives. And Khyla, would you be able to speak a little bit about what that looks like in prevention on a college campus or GCSU specifically?
Yeah, as well as everyone else, I just want to thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited. So for college campus, like domestic violences, it's more prominent than most people would think. So like, for instance, 57% of like college students who did report experiencing domestic violence said that it happened during their time in college. Because I think it's like during that period of time where people are now independent and are able to start their own relationships, and they've never really like experienced how that's supposed to look for them. So that can contribute to the fact that domestic violence is so prominent during college. And also 32% of college students are victims of domestic violence from their current or previous partner. And as I stated previously, like that plays into the fact that it could be their first relationship and they're not sure how to navigate that kind of thing. And for Project BRAVE, we're an initiative on campus that works to promote awareness as well as prevention for domestic violence. So we hold like trainings for student, faculty, and staff to help kind of like create a stronger community and engagement on the issue of domestic violence. So we have like bystander intervention training, which is it's a 3.5 hour long training that we kind of teach people about the different types of domestic violence or IPV, and we teach them effective ways to safely intervene in a situation if they were to witness it. And we also have events like Take Back the Night, as well as the Clothesline Project, which happened this past week. And like, just in regards to college domestic violence, I feel as though it's something that can impact so many aspects of their college experience. Like, going off of what Christy said, yes, there are multiple different types of IPV, like emotional, physical, sexual, but also the strongest one that we are most exposed to is academic abuse, which is when a partner uses that sense of control over another partner to kind of intervene with their schoolwork. So they could keep tabs on like people in their study group, or they could start fights prior to a test, or they could like intentionally damage schoolwork or technology. And all of those things are such crucial parts of college, like being able to get schoolwork done. So having to experience domestic violence during that time is very difficult. If students on campus are needing any resources to go to in order to get any help, counseling services that is located in the health services building on West Campus, they provide more like immediate help and care. So like right after the event could happen, they provide counseling services for that. The Title IX coordinator through the Women's Center, which is Sadie Simmons, and then also just the Women's Center in general. Although the Women's Center are mandated reporters, like we still are willing to like provide resources as well as support for anybody who might be going through IPV.
Yeah, Khyla, I remember Project BRAVE coming my freshman year last year to, y'all spoke at Greek Life, and then you also spoke for all the freshmen. And that was my first time I'd even heard there were different types. And I've heard all my friends talk about how impactful that was. And like, yes, it was mandatory, but like we got so much out of that, and all we could do was listen, and it was really engaging. And so I'm glad that that's something y'all have done on our campus. And I think it's been really impactful, especially for me and some of my friends as well. But I do want to open this up for questions. If anybody has questions to any of the speakers, Christy, Khyla, or Langston, feel free to ask any of them. You can ask all of them and somebody can hop in. But does anyone have a question to start us off?
So I'll ask one because to go off of what Khyla said. So you talked about how there were counseling services and how the Women's Center is a mandated reporter, but what are other reporting options that victims and survivors have?
I talked about it like relatively briefly, but we do also have a Title IX coordinator, and you can file like a report anonymously, and then it'll like, they'll go through the process with you with the like trial situation through the school system. And then counseling services is confidential. So if you go to them for help, they will like keep everything between you and them. And the Title IX office is a legal affairs, and then it's a criminal report through the GCPD. So like our school police, it'll like go through them as well.
Okay, I have a question. So throughout researching and just learning about all of domestic violence, I've been wondering, like I know Christy mentioned it earlier, has COVID-19 kind of shown any impact on this situation, and like how have we been trying to, because I know everything's new right now. And
Khyla, I'm not sure whether you want to speak to that specifically from the college aspect and what you're seeing within, your campus, statewide and nationally. I think we're still trying to get a handle of the, and good data to actually show what's happening. So we have a lot of like anecdotal and kind of preliminary numbers that we're seeing, and they at first appear to contradict one another. So anecdotally, we're hearing that the violence is escalating, that it's getting much worse, that the survivors who are reaching out for help are saying that the violence is just much, much worse than what it used to be, that the constant tension and what they often refer to as walking on eggshells is just heightened. And they're around their partner much, much more, especially in those beginning days when, our state and many others were on complete lockdown, and people, pretty much weren't leaving their house at all. But even now, we're all at home a whole lot more than what we ever were before. And so for people that might be living with their partner, and even those I think that aren't, you're going to see an escalation. Because imagine if for young people who are not living together with their partner, but there is that controlling, monitoring, stalking behavior, and now all of a sudden that abusive partner doesn't have as much access to that person. Imagine again what that does. Anytime they feel like they have lost control, they're going to escalate their tactics in order to try to get it. So we're hearing anecdotally about the violence getting worse. But we also at the same time are seeing a decrease in the number of hotline calls. Statewide, locally, nationally, there seems to be a decline in those, at least for like the kind of like March through June period of time. And that, again, if you think about it, might be logical, because if people are around their roommates more, where they don't have as much privacy, they might be around their parents more than what they typically would be, or again, in situations where they're actually with their partner, that person is with them and present. Their ability to get online and chat with an advocate, or reach out for help, or go somewhere to meet with somebody for counseling is greatly diminished. So that's some of the things that we're hearing and seeing. But we, in terms of actual like police reports and incidents of domestic violence, that kind of data usually takes quite a bit of time to come in and to be analyzed. It's not real-time data. It sometimes can take up to a year for us to have good information about that. And here in Georgia, for instance, GBI doesn't, I think the most recent family violence statistics that they have released are still from like 2017 or 2018. So we may not know the full impact of it for quite some time, but that's what we're hearing anecdotally.
And to go off of that, primarily Project BRAVE is more prevention and support based. So like we're not super sure about how COVID has impacted things like that, but I totally agree with everything Chrissy said, like the fact that the numbers are so low because of the constant presence within, like, with their like abusers. So like that is definitely understood.
Going off of the whole prevention thing, what are some signs or behaviors that you should look for in like a potential partner?
One thing that we have also been like discussing a lot for Domestic Violence Awareness Month is like different forms of communication, being able to talk and listen to, as well as respect in a relationship, and yeah, those things, like if you're able to comfortably communicate any issues going on in a relationship, that those are good signs, as well as like showing respect to one another. And also if you're able to actively listen to one another versus like shutting each other out and not partner to talk, or not listening to any of their concerns, those are positive signs, as well as emotional safety. So like if you feel comfortable in the presence of your partner and are able to express how you feel, then that's also a good sign.
There is also a question in the chat. I'll read it for us. It says, I know there are probably full trainings on this, but what's the first step for someone to take if they have a friend who is experiencing some of these instances of violence? And if you want to speak about that, what it looks like for Georgia College, and then if somebody else wants to speak about like what that looks like not on a college campus.
To be there for somebody who has experienced any instances of violence, the primary thing is be there for them and support them through everything they're going through. Make sure to be listening to anything they say, and like make sure that they are feeling comforted. And I know that we have a Brave Ally training, which is how to be there and support an individual who is going through domestic violence. But the main thing is just like expressing concern, but not pushing them to have to like tell you everything that's going on. So just being there for them is the best.
I'm going to put a link in the chat.
Hey, Chrissy, I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry, I clicked the unmute, but it did not take. So I'm putting a link in the chat that is for a brochure, a friends and family brochure that we created a few years ago, which we also have in Spanish as well. But this link is for the English version of it. So it gives a few tips and some information on how to help that are very similar to what Khyla said. You know, main thing is just being there, being non-judgmental, not pushing people, not thinking that this can easily be resolved by them just ending the relationship, because that actually could be quite dangerous for them to do. And encouraging them to reach out for help, offering to go with them to talk with somebody or to sit next to them while they chat with someone online, whatever it may be. And then I think, you know, some of the things that Langston talked about earlier, and that Khyla, that you were speaking about, that must be part of the bystander intervention, is not being afraid to speak up and talk with their partner in the relationship that's actually using the violence. That you know, that's important. And I think that that's one of the mistakes that our movement has made for many years, is that we have really kind of focused solely on the survivor and almost acted as if the person who is using violence in the relationship can't be saved. It's not our problem. We're just going to focus on this person. And that's one of those, what I was speaking about earlier, that root cause that is so similar to other forms of violence and other social justice issues, is that lack of humanity for other people, even people who cause harm. We have to care about them, and we have to care about why they're doing it and what has happened to them that has led them to this place, and what happens to the point forward. We have to care about them as much as we do the victim, if we're ever going to really help them. And honestly, that's what the vast majority of survivors want. Sure, there are people that say, I'm done with this and I want out of this relationship, and I don't want to see this person anymore. But there are so many people, especially as folks get older and their lives become even more intertwined with this person, that they don't want bad things to happen to them. They may quite likely not want this person to be arrested or to go to jail or prison. They just want them to get help. And so part of that intervention and how to help has to be caring about them as well.
I love all of those points. I mean, one thing that comes up for me when I think about this is, because I think we've all had conversations like this, and we've all had friends that have experienced abusive or controlling behaviors or violence. But one thing that comes up for me is that when our friends are kind of like sharing and disclosing and telling us about these things, that we don't get in a space of, if they don't make the choice we want, then we punish them for it, right? Like, because that's almost kind of like this thing of, we're doing exactly what that person in that abusive relationship is doing, is kind of like passing judgment and doing all of these really, really like challenging things, because they're not making the choice we want them to make in that moment. I love what Christy said about, like, you know, seeing the humanity of everyone involved, because one of the things that I've noticed in doing my work with like men is that the overwhelming majority of them are also victims. So what does that mean in terms of like thinking about that cycle of violence, and, you know, seeing and intervening with this man who witnessed another man be violent or abusive towards a woman in his life when he was a little boy? And how do you kind of carry that? And how does he kind of rationalize like witnessing that as a child and then his behavior as an adult? So that's another thing to think about. The last tip that I have in terms of like resources is, I've actually put this in my phone. It's the National DV Hotline, right? And like, it's a way, my understanding, I'm pretty sure about this, is that it routes you to the closest domestic violence, like, or like advocacy hotline. Is that correct, Christy? I'm kind of.
They will connect you. It's like a warm handoff. So that it doesn't automatically route you if it's the national number. They will connect you, like do a 3-way call and make sure that you actually get the help that you need. And by the way, those of us that are of a certain age think of things as like somebody picking up the phone and calling the hotline, but times have changed, of course. Here, not only here are we on Zoom, but the way that a lot of people would rather communicate nowadays is through text and messaging and live chat. And so the national hotline actually has all of those capabilities as well.
And it's a great resource for folks who aren't sure about what to say, right? I think part of this conversation that we have to have and we have to be honest about is that sometimes we don't always know what the right thing is to say. I mean, we can try to be as supportive and as compassionate and not ask questions and do all of those things as we'd like, but it's also important to know what you don't know, right? And realizing that you know what you don't know also means you realize you can do harm, if you kind of like share something or get in a place where you're not creating safety for that person or being empathetic and being helpful. So.
Well, thank y'all for sharing that. We have time for maybe one more question if anybody else has a question. And also they put the link in the chat for that phone number, and you can Google it as well and get the text and chat stuff. But does anyone have one more question? Well, if not, that's okay. I just want to say thank you again from our group for participating in this and speaking with us today. That was awesome, really informative, and I really enjoyed it. I don't know if Jennifer or Melissa have anything else to say. Do y'all have anything else you want to close us out with? Or
I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for being here. Echoing Grace's great conversation. If folks want to continue these conversations, we have a number of trainings, as Khyla mentioned, through the Women's Center and Project BRAVE, our Project BRAVE, our BRAVE ally that Khyla mentioned, as well as trying to get our men's anti-violence group back going. They've been super active the last 4 years. Our fearless male peer facilitator has graduated, and so we are looking for a new person to fill his shoes on that. So if that's something that folks are interested in, please come see us, reach out to us. Melissa and I would love to chat with you.
all right, thank y'all so much. Y'all have a great rest of the day, and they will be posting this, the recorded version, on Facebook at the Women's Center and also on the Project BRAVE page as well. So y'all have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.